Okay, we're back for the second part of Chapter 6 video lecture on language. We had just started talking about backward reconstruction and trying to figure out where languages come from. And so this is a great picture to sort of show you the PIE, or Proto-Indo-European language family, in terms of the subfamilies, like you have the Germanic and the Slavic and the Romance. Those are all subfamilies, and then individual families come off of them. And we can tell where they come from, again, by looking at the cognates and looking at how words are softened over time. We kind of get lazy as we get more familiar with languages, and that's sort of how changes occur within languages. There are linguists that feel that the PIE tree can go back even further, and you'll notice that in here, this little square would be the PIE branch of an even bigger tree of mother tongues. And so all the language families would be offshoots of the mother tongue. But we really have no idea if there was one mother tongue that we all were talking, as modern humans or humans in Africa. We don't know that. There's really no way of proving it. So we just have some theories, and that's kind of where we're going to get into now. So Colin Renfrew is one particular linguist who has several theories. He actually has a theory about 3 different language families. So he says that the 3 main language families all started around the same area, but they have slightly different hearths, and they of course diffused and spread into other areas. So for Renfrew, he says that the hearth of PIE, or Proto-Indo-European, is Anatolia, which is today Turkey, and it diffused up through this area into the rest of Europe, and that's how European languages were able to speak the PIE languages. He says that there were also languages spoken more in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, and also North Africa. And the hearth of that would be the western arc of the Fertile Crescent, kind of where Iraq is, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are. So we would believe that those would be those Afro-Asiatic languages. And then lastly, the languages that are on the eastern arc of the Fertile Crescent would be diffusing over into India. So those would be more of like the Dravidian languages. And that's sort of his theory on language diffusion. The other theorists that we're going to talk about in this chapter are only going to be discussing the PIE theory, the Proto-Indo-European theory of diffusion. So Stephen Oppenheimer is another linguist, and his theory is he takes the idea that people left Central Africa but were not speaking PIE at that point. And they traveled and migrated through the Arabian Peninsula until they got to India. And India is actually the hearth of Proto-Indo-European for him. And this has some bearing, certainly, when we remember William Jones is the one that said that Sanskrit came from Greek. And we know Hindi came from Sanskrit. So perhaps there is some logic that it started in India and then went throughout back into Europe. So Oppenheimer again says that India is the hearth, and then people migrated back through Oppenheimer's hearth of Anatolia to Europe. So it's sort of a precursor to Renfrew's hypothesis. There's also the agriculture and conquest theories. So for the most part, these have the same hearths, which is Anatolia, but the means of diffusion is different. So the agricultural theory says that as people were farming and learned how to farm, they spread their language by teaching others as they migrated how to farm. And so as farming took off and spread, so did the Proto-Indo-European languages. The other theory that has the same hearth is the conquest theory. Maybe a little more credible with this one, I don't know. But this says that as people conquered others, they forced them to speak the Proto-Indo-European language family. So that the hearth is the same, but as people rode on horseback and sought other people and took over the land, they forced their language on others, hence the Proto-Indo-European language spreads. Both of those are 2 other theories. The last theory is the dispersal hypothesis. This says that there were actually two main hearths right around the Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, but then also an offshoot also was in Anatolia. But as the people migrated around the Caspian Sea, they spread their language with them. And so this is the dispersal hypothesis. It went circled back around into Europe. The main ideas of these theories are, one, they all consistently have something around the Black Sea. So you'll notice Black Sea, Black Sea. They all deal with something with the Black Sea, and they all have to end up in Europe because that's where the Proto-Indo-European family is most pronounced. So those are the comparison of all of the theories. Of course, they all have slightly different ideas of how it spread and where it spread first from and to. But you ultimately end up in Europe. That's a point. We've kind of talked about this already in terms of the languages of Europe. Romance, Germanic, and Slavic are your subfamilies, and then French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian are the individual families within there, and so forth. Just kind of make sure you're learning some of these. At least these tend to come up a whole lot on the AP exam, so I want to kind of stress them, and they will be on our test as well. One thing that stands out, this is sort of the anomaly to the whole system, is that somehow there has been a language that has survived and was not taken over, was not lost when Proto-Indo-European families came into Europe. And this is the Euskera language, which is spoken by the Basque people. They live within the mountainous region between Spain and France. They have been able to keep their language alive. It has not been lost, but it doesn't mix with any other language in Europe. It's not the Pi language family, it's not the Altaic, it's not the Uralic, it is completely separate. So it's really kind of extraordinary that it's been able to survive this long and not been taken over. The Basque people have tried to, there are some people in the Basque community that would like to have a separate country, but so far that has not happened. Of course, one thing that they would like to do with their own country is, of course, make sure that Euskera is continued to be kept alive and doesn't die out. Besides Europe, we need to talk about sub-Saharan Africa for the most part. So this is, again, like I said before, extreme language diversity, lots of fragmentation. You'll notice all these different language families that you find within the continent. A couple things stand out to me. You should know the dominant language is the Niger-Congo. You should know that. You should also know that the Khoisan is the oldest language family still spoken in the world. This is the San people. The Click language is part of the Khoisan language family. So this is where you would find that language family. And then the other thing that stands out to me is this little island over here, Madagascar, has a completely different language family. And it actually is the language family that you would find more in Indonesia or the South Pacific. So the thought process is that the peoples of Africa never really migrated off the continent, whereas people that already lived in the islands of Indonesia or of other islands within the South Pacific, they knew how to navigate the oceans. They brought their language to this island, and that's why Madagascar has a language family unlike any other in Africa. So kind of keep that in mind as well. One country that is sort of a focus in this chapter is Nigeria. Nigeria has over 400 different languages spoken. English is typically taught in school. The debate is that once kids get out of school, they're having trouble finding jobs. They're having trouble being able to use their languages usefully, you know what I mean, because they have been taught English, and English is not what's being used so much in business, at least in a lot of local businesses in Nigeria. So there's debate about whether they should actually keep it as the official language or the language spoken in schools. And again, you know, that's something that some people would argue makes sense for the future, as English is more of our global language right now, but others feel like that also lends itself to the loss of these 400 different languages that have been around in Nigeria for a very, very long time. So, debatable. Two main sections of the chapter left. One is certainly how language is diffused. We've kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of the diffusion theories like conquest and agriculture. So human interaction is key to everything. Humans have to interact for languages to diffuse. Print has also made a huge part of how languages are diffused. They also standardize languages. So the Gutenberg printing press in 1440 did a whole lot. We'll talk about this once again in chapter 7 with religion. But it helps standardize languages. When you see words printed down, everyone spells them the same way, about the same way. So it standardizes the language. We don't have as much, disagreement about spelling of things and using grammar, those kind of things. So print has done a whole lot for how languages last and diffuse. We mentioned migration. Trade goes along with that. The idea of nation states means mostly this has to do with the fact that as we have an idea of having one country with one group of people that speak a language, they want to preserve that language. And that's how, and even to the point where they also want to show others their language and maybe even make their language spread to other people. So the rise of nation states has also been a way that languages diffuse. And of course, we mentioned colonialism, certainly the reason why Indo-European language family is so widespread around the world. There's a couple vocab terms we need to discuss. So lingua franca, this is a language that is used just for trade and commerce. So oftentimes you'll hear this has been a free response question a couple times. This is where people speak different languages at home, but when they come together to engage in trade, to buy, to sell, they don't, since they know the other one doesn't speak their language, they revert to a language that they both know. Maybe they learned it in school, or maybe it's more of a something you would see more on television or in media. And so the language is simply used to engage in trade, be able to buy, to be able to sell, and then they go back home and they speak their separate languages. So that's what a lingua franca is. A pidgin language is what English started out as being. So when you have two languages and they come together in one place, and so somebody meets somebody else, they speak two different languages, so they try and combine parts of the two languages together so that they can communicate. Typically, these are the simpler words. So if you have two words for the same thing, whichever one is easier for both to say, that's what they're going to choose to add. And so that's how it becomes a combination of two languages. If you've ever been to Hawaii, this is also a great example of pidgin language, where they speak English, they also speak the Polynesian language together, and you'll hear the combination together. Now, over a long period of time, as that pidgin language develops more concrete rules and the people start only using that combined language, then it has become a Creole language. So English today is a Creole language, but it began as a pidgin language. There are a couple other things we need to talk about real quickly. So monolingual states are ones where there's only one language spoken. Now, that's really hard to believe, but it's not exactly true, but for the most part, they consider themselves to be monolingual. So Japan, Uruguay, Venezuela, Iceland, Denmark, Portugal, Poland. Multilingual states are the majority of countries in the world. These will, of course, have multiple languages spoken, like the United States, like Canada and Belgium. And then official languages are ones that are enforced by the government. Typically, this is not something, it's of course taught in schools and government engages in business in, but also businesses are required. Signage has to be in the official language, so forth. Real quickly, India has 22 official languages. You'll notice from the map, of course, you can see the different language families found there, so that might explain why there's so many. Real quickly, just a global language. Is there in one day, will there be one language that everybody speaks? That's debatable. Certainly, a lot of people have felt that English might be that way, but remember that 200 years ago, French was the global language, and that didn't last, so keep that in mind. Last section really quickly is about toponyms, so the way that language plays a role in the place, in the uniqueness of a location, and we want to bestow a quality on a place. That's a toponym. Toponyms reflect the history there. They reflect the groups that have occupied it. And these are the 10 basic types of toponym. I'm not going to go through them. Of course, if you have questions, you can ask, and this gives you an example of them. But again, changing toponyms is a big deal. We oftentimes change toponyms to, again, maybe keep our culture alive, like this is the city with the longest name in the world. in the Welsh language. We sometimes do it because of a historical change in the political arena, and we also tend to do this to commodify a place. So FedEx Field or Disney Times Square. It's very possible that we may live in like McDonald's, Georgia soon, and because of how trade has become so important. So that really sums up our chapter 6. I hope this has been helpful. Thank